and welcome to the Russian Empire History Podcast, the history of all the peoples of the Russian Empire. I'm your host, JP Bristow, and this is Season 1, The Forest, the Steppe, and the Birth of the Russian Empire, and Episode 85, Ivan I, the Moneybag. You've probably noticed that I've been trying out weekly episodes of around 30 minutes instead of fortnightly episodes around 50 minutes to an hour. It's a bit more writing, but it's easier to record and edit, and it also seems that the algorithms like the weekly release schedule and put it in front of more people, so I had a decent bump in listeners. So I'm going to carry on like this for now. There won't be episodes absolutely every week. Some weeks there will only be the members episode, and occasionally I have other obligations. Anyway, on with the show. Ivan Danilovich is usually regarded as the first significant knyaz of Moscow, the one in the traditional imperial narrative who lays the foundations for Moscow's rise. The Muscovite chroniclers also present him this way. As the chronicler states, quote, "When Grand Knyaz Ivan Danilovich sat on the throne of the Grand Knyaz of all Rus, there was great peace for 40 years. The pagans ceased to fight against the Rus land and kill Christians. The Christians found rest and relief from great oppression, many burdens, and from Tatar violence, and there was great peace in all the land." End quote. Actually, the mid-14th century was not all that peaceful, and Ivan faced the same problem the Grand Knyazes had faced for the last 100 years, the great difficulty of compelling anyone to acknowledge his authority when he had only limited resources available to him. According to historian John Fennell, quote, "The disappointingly scant available evidence shows that it was a period of tension, confusion, instability, and growing danger from the West." End quote. But looking back from our vantage point, we can say that Moscow staked its claim to be the preeminent knyazhstvo during Ivan's reign, and his descendants will lose the throne of the Grand Knyaz only for a brief interlude. Ivan's reign did not start particularly successfully, as we already heard last time. Ozbeg had either split the authority between him and Alexander Vasilievich of Suzdal, who had received the Yarlik for Vladimir, or given Alexander Vasilievich precedence. At the same time, Ivan and the new Knyaz of Tver, Konstantin Mikhailovich, were told by Ozbeg that they needed to bring him Alexander Mikhailovich to explain the Tver uprising. This division of authority is sometimes explained as a reaction to the Tver uprising, with Ozbeg deciding that it was too risky to have one knyaz in charge, and therefore Moscow needed a new rival. Plus, Ivan could also be seen as having failed his mission in 1327, when Tver was punished, but Alexander Mikhailovich was allowed to escape. Having received his orders, Ivan, Constantine of Tver, and the Novgorodians sent a joint embassy to Alexander in Pskov, telling him that he was required to appear before the Khan. Despite high-level emissaries, including the Archbishop of Novgorod, Alexander refused. Ozbeg was not happy with this response, another failure by Ivan, and according to the Pskov Chronicle, ordered all the knyazes to take action to seize Alexander Mikhailovich and deliver him to the Khan. Now, Ivan managed to bring together a serious army with the knyazes of Tver, Suzdal, and, the chronicles say, many others, as well as Metropolitan Peter's recently appointed Greek successor, Feognost, and they marched on Pskov. At first there was resistance. Alexander and Pskov had signed an agreement that the city would not hand him over to the knyazes, so he had to be persuaded to go voluntarily. Ivan sent a delegation into the city, which warned that if Alexander did not go, the Mongols would destroy Pskov. According to the chronicle, Alexander was willing to remove this threat from the city, but the people of Pskov argued against it, declaring that they were ready to stand with him to the end. Pskov's ability to defy the combined army of the Suzdalian knyazes might have surprised you, but as we will see next episode, at this time, Lithuania was emerging as a genuine rival to the northeastern Kняжества. Pskov was increasingly under Lithuanian influence, and their defiance is likely based on their belief that they would have Lithuanian support if it came to war. This is also likely the reason why Ivan was cautious about using his army. Instead of moving against Pskov, he withdrew around 150 kilometers to a town called Opochka. Most of the chronicles state that he realized he would not be able to take. This was when he decided to turn to the new Metropolitan for help, as we heard last time. Ivan would hardly have wanted to return and tell Ozbeg that he had failed yet again, but with the Metropolitan he demonstrated his resourcefulness in finding a new way, the excommunication, to tackle the problem. Alexander fled to Lithuania, but as he did not take his family, it's likely that he was already conceding that he would have to return to Tver, which he did the following year. This incident is usually treated as Ivan's first major success, but what it actually shows is how much power the church had. Without Feognost, even the fact that Ivan had managed to gather the knyazes together would not have been enough to displace Alexander from Pskov. And, of course, he had still not delivered Alexander to the Mongols, and the fugitive was safe in Lithuania. As yet, Ivan had done nothing to show that he deserved any special consideration from Ozbeg, but his luck improved in 1331 when Alexander Vasilievich died. He immediately rushed to the horde, along with his supporter, Constantine of Tver, to press his case, and returned a few months later with his Yarlik, in the company of a Mongol official named Albucha, who installed him on the throne of Vladimir. The return to a single Grand Knyaz marks a change in Ozbeg's policy, but if Ivan had finally reached the top, he was still completely dependent on the horde. Ivan will spend more than half his life visiting the Mongols, and most of his time elsewhere carrying out the instructions he received from the Khan. Ivan rules for the next 9 years, and the Khan does not interfere in affairs among the knyazes or supply military assistance to any of them for their local conflicts, as the Mongols have done continuously for the last few decades. Even the return of Alexander Mikhailovich to Tver does not mean that that rivalry is revived. In 1334, Alexander at last responded to Ozbeg's demands. He did not go to the Khan himself, but he sent his son Fyodor, who returned from Sarai to Tver the following year, along with a Mongol official. In 1336, Alexander travelled to Tver, presumably for some kind of negotiations with Constantine, the Mongol official, and the city boyars, although the chronicles simply state that he collected Fyodor and returned to Lithuania. Next, Alexander exchanged messages with Vyognost, seeking his protection before attempting any return. Vyognost appears to have accepted his overtures, although the Archbishop of Novgorod remained hostile. And finally, in 1338, Alexander visited Sarai. He received a pardon from the Khan and was allowed to return to Tver. In the autumn, he and his family returned to the city. But the following year, Fyodor visited Sarai while Ivan was there on one of his frequent trips. The chronicles once again refer to lawless people making false accusations and the devil interfering, and the Khan detained Fyodor. A message was sent to Tver to tell Alexander that the Khan would allow him to come and collect his son. In late September, Alexander arrived in Sarai and was imprisoned. Around a year later, they were both executed. The brief era of Tver competing for leadership of the northeastern Knyazhstva was over. There's been a fair amount of debate among historians over why Ozbeg allowed Alexander to return and reinstated him as knyaz. Why did he make efforts to capture him over several years and then just put him back where he'd been? There's no clear answer, but if we accept the chronicle's position that he was not involved in the Tver uprising, other than to advise his people against it, it may be that an immediate execution where his guilt was not obvious would have antagonized the other knyazes and the church. One thing that all historians do agree on is that Ivan worked assiduously to gather the Khan's tribute for him. This led to him acquiring his sobriquet, Ivan Kalita, Ivan the Moneybag, using a Turkic word for the leather bags that were used to send the tribute to the horde. The chronicles, which are, unfortunately, again very scant concerning his reign, also talk about him leading a campaign against Smolensk in 1339 at the behest of the Khan. This has led some to question whether Ivan should be regarded as having any independent policy of his own at all, or simply as the Mongols' tool in the northeast. Others argue that it's natural for Ozbeg to look like he was calling the shots, which lines up with his general reforms to increase centralization and his active involvement in the management of his empire's other frontiers. And the question is how Moscow turned doing the Khan's bidding to its advantage. In 1389, Dmitry Donskoy, Ivan's grandson, drew up his will. He made the following bequests, quote, I bestow upon my son, Knyaz Yuri, my grandfather's purchase of Galich and all its districts. And I bestow upon my son, Knyaz Andrei, my grandfather's purchase of Bielo-Ozero and all its districts. And I bestow upon my son, Prince Pyotr, my grandfather's purchase of Uglich, and all that is dependent upon it for tax purposes. End quote. This passage has been taken at face value as describing Ivan expanding the Kняжество of Moscow by purchasing these three other Kняжества, using the profits from his tax-gathering activities, which has led to him being acclaimed as a gatherer of the Rus, a concept we will see more of later, and laying the foundations for Russian unification. So what's the problem? The problem is that these supposed purchases, or alternatively the word could be rendered as joining, are not previously mentioned anywhere in the chronicles, wills, or treaties of either Ivan or his two sons who ruled after him, Simeon and Ivan II, and historians have been trying to figure out what it actually means ever since. But let's just step back a bit and look at it more widely. If Ivan became the leading knyaz in terms of authority given by the Mongols, did he manage to unify the kняжество at all? The evidence is very scant that he did. If we look around the kняжества we discussed a couple of episodes back, saying that they had effectively become independent and in some cases barely seem to have been in contact with the other kняжества, we see little change during Ivan's reign. Ryazan, lying south of Susdalia, seems to have had some kind of defense agreement with Moscow. Although it's barely mentioned in the chronicles for the first part of the 14th century, its knyazes do appear from time to time when they join military campaigns. However, there's no indication that they are in any way dependent on Moscow, and a better explanation may simply be that the Mongols told them to join these campaigns. We know for sure that the knyazes of Ryazan paid their own tribute directly to the Khan, not via the Grand Knyaz of Vladimir. Sometime around the middle of the 14th century, the Knyaz of Ryazan starts calling himself the Grand Knyaz of Ryazan, hardly an indicator that he considered himself anyone's vassal. For the petty kняжество of Susdalia, we again struggle to see any evidence of Moscow's control. The knyazes do join military campaigns, and we get the odd snippet about marriages, but none of the treaties between the Grand Knyaz and the knyazes have survived. There are some texts suggesting that Rostov was under Ivan's control, but they are written somewhat later and are regarded as not entirely reliable. The most that we can say with certainty is that there's no evidence that any of the knyazes opposed Ivan. When Alexander Vasilievich of Suzdal died, there is a hint that Ivan may have taken control of Nizhny Novgorod and Gorodets, while Alexander's brother Constantine succeeded in Suzdal itself. At least, when Ivan died, his eldest son was in Nizhny Novgorod, and in 1343, Simeon of Moscow unsuccessfully tried to persuade the Khan to give him the Yarlik for Nizhny Novgorod. The knyazes of Bielozero and Yaroslavl appear to have been supporters of Alexander Mikhailovich. They were summoned to Sarai when Alexander went to collect Fyodor, but the chronicles do not tell us what happened to them. Soon after, Ivan married one of his daughters into each of their houses. Presumably the marriages and the execution of Alexander and Fyodor was sufficient to win their support for Moscow. But, as I'm sure you've noticed, none of this adds up to Ivan buying any kняжества or taking control of them in any other way. So what is going on in Dmitry Donskoy's will? Historians have ventured a variety of explanations. One theory is that they were attached to Vladimir, not Moscow, which would explain why they were not mentioned in Simeon and Ivan II's wills. Another is that the knyazes sold their independence, but otherwise retained all the trappings of being knyaz. Another is that Ivan wasn't involved at all. Dmitry Donskoy seized these lands by force himself and invented the story of his grandfather's purchases as a justification. Still, other historians argue that the so-called purchases took place at the same time as the marriages with Ivan's daughters, and that even if we do not have direct evidence, we should assume that Ivan would not just give his daughters away for nothing in exchange. Between Ivan's time and Dmitry Donskoy, Galich, Bielo-Ozero, and Uglich barely appear in the chronicles. But in 1363, Dmitry is in conflict with the Knyaz of Galich, and we have mention of apparently independent knyazes in Bielo-Ozero at least until 1380. Uglich isn't mentioned again at all until the end of the century. But as John Fennell writes, quote, "We must regretfully come to the conclusion that there is insufficient evidence to show that Ivan I effectively altered the relationship between himself and the principalities of Galich, Bielo-Ozero, and Uglich, or made them in any way dependent on himself, as either Knyaz of Moscow or as Grand Knyaz of Vladimir." End quote. Other than the traditional Grand Knyaz's role of calling the knyazes to join military campaigns, for which he would have had the additional weight of Mongol backing, there's no compelling evidence that Ivan expanded Moscow rule to any of the other knyazhestva. When looking at this period, you'll find that most historians see Ozbeg's initial policy towards the knyazes as focused on keeping them weak and dependent, on divide and rule. The choice of the Knyaz of Moscow as Grand Knyaz is often explicitly explained as due to Moscow's weakness. In A New Imperial History of Northeast Eurasia, which I think I mentioned before was originally written to be a new university-level history textbook a few years back, but which certainly doesn't match the required ideology in Russia these days, this period comes under the heading Survival of the Weakest, the Rise of the Appanage Moscow Principality. The textbook argues for Ozbeg choosing Moscow because it was not merely weak, but the weakest of the knyazhestva, and that the subsequent reduction in conflict among the knyazes, the emergence of Moscow as leader, and the beginning of political consolidation is surprising and has no real explanation. Ivan becoming the Khan's main tax collector is put down to this being the cheapest and easiest option for Ozbeg, compared to sending Mongols to do it or supervise, rather than any of Ivan's accomplishments or ability to do the job. When you set out, as the textbook's authors did, to contradict and correct the established imperial narrative of Moscow's inevitable and divinely inspired rise to greatness, it's perhaps forgivable if the pendulum swings a little too far back the other way. We can agree that all the knyazhestva were weak, no reason to argue there. But was Moscow really the weakest? As I said last time, the chronicles don't really give us much idea of the personality of the knyazes. It accounted for a lot, given the scale of the rivalries. But even without that, I don't think we can say that Moscow was the weakest To begin with, was Moscow really weaker than Starodub or any of the other minor kняжества that the chronicles have given up mentioning altogether? It seems safe to assume that they did nothing of significance. Meanwhile, right at the very beginning of its existence, Moscow had successfully taken Mozhaisk and Kolomna by force. Small places, to be sure, but they expanded Moscow's control to most of the Moscow River Valley, and just by taking and holding them, Moscow demonstrated a certain amount of strength. Then Moscow was able to take and hold Pereyaslav, even though the Grand Knyaz wanted it for himself. We see Moscow turning up in the chronicles as a participant in various campaigns, with mixed success to be sure, but not always losing. Most importantly, especially for the long term, Moscow had secured the backing of the church. The Metropolitan moved his residence to Moscow in 1325, before Ivan had even received his Yardak, and Moscow kept this backing even when it led to the Grand Knyaz attempting to remove the Metropolitan, and kept it when the Metropolitan died and a successor was appointed. I have to note that although I've read many books in which historians argue that Ozbeg backed Moscow because it was weak, with the very fair implication that this made it dependent and controllable, I've not read any that argued that the church aligned itself with the Moscow knyazes because they were weak. I think you'll agree that it would be a very strange motivation for the church. The Metropolitan must have seen something of value there. So I don't think we should go overboard on the weakness of Moscow. It was weak because all the kняжества were weak. It was vulnerable in the same way that Tver had been when Ozbeg sent a punitive army north to break it, as we heard in the last episode. Something similar could have happened to Moscow at any time over the next century, and then we would not be here talking about it. But I think it would be wrong to think of Moscow as especially weak relative to the other kняжества. It is already shown that it can hold its own. So the question then arises of why, if Ozbeg's initial policy was to keep the kняжества weak and divided, did he, a decade later, reverse this course and apparently throw his weight behind making Ivan the Moneybag of Moscow his one chosen knyaz? Here we find that historians have more agreement. The key issue driving the change in Mongol policy was the emergence of Lithuania as a new power. Not merely a neighbouring power and a new threat in the northwest. Lithuania was absorbing the western and southern kняжества and challenging Mongol claims to overlordship, and looking to extend its influence to the northeastern kняжества. As more Orthodox Slavs came under its rule, it also looked to challenge the idea that the Metropolitan should be in Moscow, and if he was, whether there should be another Metropolitan in Lithuania. The Mongols had new cause for concern. The knyazes of the northeast had a new rival claiming the old Rus kняжество, and the church had a new pretender to its authority. It will be a rivalry that lasts for centuries. Thank you for listening, and until next time, goodbye.